Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story: Beijing's spy agency is secretly building a network with China-controlled nonprofits here in the U.S. and linking them with Chinese courts and policing departments. NTD spoke to Philip Lenzicki, the senior investigative reporter with the Daily Caller News Foundation, who investigated.
They were stalking, surveilling, harassing, and even attempting to forcibly repatriate dissidents back to China. So the same concern would be here as well.
The Pentagon says Panama will back off from its infrastructure deal with China and work more closely with the U.S. But has the country agreed to let U.S. warships pass through the canal for free? More on what both sides are saying. The Treasury Department dishes out new sanctions on an international network moving oil shipments from Iran to China. The action just 2 days after President Trump promised to restore maximum pressure on Iran. And China sends a complaint to the World Trade Organization all about Trump's new tariffs. But does the move carry any weight? Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Before we dive into today's news, make sure to use the link down below to subscribe to our newsletter. Each week we round up the highlights and controversies happening around China and the world, and share an exclusive behind-the-scenes snapshot with our readers. Keep an eye out. The newsletter will land in your inbox Friday morning. Jumping into today's headlines, a warning about next-level infiltration from Beijing. An investigation by the Daily Caller News Foundation reveals China is building an underground justice system here in the U.S., built on long-arm groups overseas. Analysts warn it's a whole nother level of infiltration by the Chinese Communist Party, and it poses serious concerns to America. The system has two parts. The first is made up of China-controlled nonprofits based in the U.S. The second is comprised of the judicial and law enforcement departments inside China. Connecting them together is China's United Front Work Department, a state-run spy and propaganda agency. Together, they form a so-called shadow justice system operating on U.S. soil, but with strong ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Let's zoom in on the China-controlled nonprofits operating in the U.S. According to the report, Chinese law enforcement agencies appointed at least 8 people to serve as so-called overseas mediators and hearing officers for these groups in the U.S. The cases these mediators handle appear mundane, such as driver's license renewals, divorce cases, or property disputes. But there's more to the story. They're tasked with collecting documents and sometimes holding unsanctioned underground court hearings in the U.S. on behalf of Chinese courts. Philip Lenzicki is a senior investigative reporter with the Daily Caller News Foundation and wrote the report.
As we saw with the America Changle Association that was operating the overseas Chinese police station in Manhattan, while they also claimed that they were only processing Chinese driver's license renewals and these type of things, the Department of Justice found that, in fact, they were stalking, surveilling, harassing, and even attempting to forcibly repatriate dissidents back to China. So the same concern would be here as well.
The Changle Association is among the nonprofits tied to the overseas Chinese Justice Network. Last December, a leading member of Changle pleaded guilty for acting as a foreign agent for China in the U.S. He's said to be sentenced in May and faces up to 5 years in prison. It's worth noting people who turn to this network for help are mostly Chinese nationals living in the U.S. who still have business, properties, or relatives in China.
And so the concern here is that these courts, for instance, even if it is only that they are helping, resolve matters like international divorce cases or something to that effect, when someone's wealth is on the line, when their children are on the line, should there be a Chinese court here that we must remember isn't just a group of people that are totally detached from anything sinister. No, these are individuals that are also tied up with the United Front Work Department. So when we have individuals like that, they might be incentivized to try and exact some type of deal from those who are in the courts. That is to say, you might show up to court for a divorce, but in order to get the settlement that you're after, it might be implied that you must cooperate with other things that the Chinese government wishes for you to do in the United States or elsewhere. So that begins to go into a territory where there would be obviously serious concerns.
Congressman John Molinar is the chairman of the House Select Committee on China. He said the Chinese regime's attempts to impose its repressive legal system on U.S. soil through the CCP's United Front network is an unacceptable assault on U.S. sovereignty and the rule of law.
We're a sovereign nation, and no other nation should be operating unsanctioned courts within our borders. So first and foremost, that's wrong. This shouldn't be allowed. And it's a deep type of infiltration, and you could even say colonization effort that they're engaging in across the world.
Lan Shu is a longtime media commentator on China affairs.
The Chinese Communist Party's ultimate goal is to undermine the freedom and democracy of Western countries. The Chinese Communist Party's strategy is not limited to overseas Chinese communities. It has also made significant inroads into mainstream American society. All of these efforts are part of the CCP's broader global expansion and various infiltration efforts.
And the plan doesn't just target the U.S. alone. One Chinese law enforcement agency's website shows Chinese people from the UK, Italy, Japan, Australia, and several other countries in Africa and Latin America were also tasked with developing similar underground overseas court systems for China. Panama is denying making a free transit deal with the U.S. The State Department wrote in a social media post that fees would be waived for American warships passing through the Panama Canal, adding it would save America millions of dollars per year. In a statement, the Panama Canal Authority claimed it had not waived any charges for U.S. vessels, though it said it was open to dialogue over what would happen to fees in the event of wartime. The back and forth came just days after Secretary of State Marco Rubio toured the canal with Panama's president. The two spoke about China's operations and influence in the region, with a focus on Panama's involvement in China's Belt and Road Initiative. The global infrastructure project is criticized by the West for trapping less developed countries in debt and forcing them to hand over usage rights to strategic infrastructure to China in exchange. Panama agreed to step away from its Belt and Road deal and even said it would pull out early if possible. Rubio called the move a, quote, great step forward. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, the Pentagon said the U.S. military would expand cooperation with Panama's security forces. From the campaign trail to the White House, President Trump has long expressed concerns over China's footprint in the waterway.
China's involved with the Panama Canal. They won't be for long, and that's the way it has to be. We're going to get something very strong, or we're going to take it back. And China will be dealt with.
Panama was the first Latin American nation to officially endorse the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative. Currently, a Hong Kong-based company operates 2 ports in the Panama Canal, located at both entrances of the waterway. A consortium of Chinese state-run firms is working to build a 4th bridge over the strategic waterway. Connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the Panama Canal is a vital trade route for the U.S. Roughly 40% of all American container vessels pass through the waterway every year. That makes the United States the world's largest customer of the canal. An international network shipping sanctioned Iranian oil to China, now slapped with sanctions. The Treasury Department imposed the penalty on Thursday. The Treasury Department accuses the network of enabling oil shipments to China on behalf of Iran, specifically the Iranian military and sanctioned company Sefer Energy. The department said the shipments are worth hundreds of millions of dollars and are funding the Iranian military. The State Department also chimed in, saying the U.S. will not tolerate Iran's destructive and destabilizing behavior. It also noted the proceeds of the oil sales are used to support terrorist and proxy groups. The Treasury sanctioned targets entities and individuals in China, as well as India and the United Arab Emirates, plus several vessels. It comes only 2 days after President Trump signed a memo to impose maximum pressure on Iran. Pushback from Beijing at the World Trade Organization, Beijing filing a complaint against President Trump's tariffs on Chinese imports. Here are the details.
China filed a World Trade Organization complaint against U.S. President Donald Trump's new 10% tariff on Chinese imports. In the Wednesday filing, China argues that the tariff, as well as Trump's cancellation of a duty-free exemption for low-value packages, are protectionist and break WTO rules. Beijing's complaint also comes after Trump's move to shut a trade loophole that allowed small-value packages to be shipped duty-free. The so-called de minimis provision, used widely by e-commerce giants like Shein and Temu, exempted packages with goods worth less than $800 from duties. Around 1.36 billion shipments entered the United States using the de minimis provision in 2024. The Trump administration has blamed the de minimis exemption for allowing fentanyl and its precursor chemicals to enter the U.S. unscreened. Recent Reuters reporting has also found that drug traffickers are exploiting the exemption.
Back to Beijing's complaint, experts say China is unlikely to secure a victory with its complaint. That's because the WTO body that settles trade disputes has been unable to function since 2019. Coming up, Vice President J.D. Vance sending a message at the International Religious Freedom Summit. Advancing religious freedom is a priority for the Trump administration. Other attendees shared why it's urgent to root out communism in the U.S. And Chinese e-commerce platforms could soon be bracing for impact from the European Union. Officials from the bloc are proposing a new rule to curb the flow of cheap products entering the EU. That's coming up. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Vice President J.D. Vance has a message for the nation. Advancing religious freedom is a priority for the Trump administration. The topic was front and center while he addressed the International Religious Freedom Summit. NTD's Melina Weisskopf brings us the highlights from the annual gathering.
Vice President J.D. Vance addressed the International Religious Freedom Summit with the message of how America was founded. He said this nation was founded on moral principles and said that the Trump administration is dedicated to solidifying and promoting religious freedom at home and abroad. Here's J.D. Vance earlier.
In America, our founding fathers rightly recognized this, listing freedom of religion first among the liberties enshrined in our great Constitution. Before he was elected president, John Adams, who was the first vice president, I might add, observed that politicians, quote, may plan and speculate for liberty, but it is religion and morality alone which can establish the principles upon which freedom can securely stand.
Some participants tell me they'd like to see the Trump administration impose sanctions on officials that violate religious freedoms in countries all over the world. Others tell me they'd like to see the Trump administration reenact the Abraham Accords to bring peace to the Middle East.
To maintain peace, stability in the Middle East and entire world, we need to go back to our source, our father Abraham. And then Muslim, Christians, and Jews are from the same family.
Others shared with me the urgency of rooting out communism as a major step to promoting freedom of belief.
Communism usually first goes for religion, and they want to abolish religion so that people don't have anything to believe in, and they try to strip that away as one of the first things under a communist regime.
And we heard a similar message from a group of students for Falun Gong, representing a spiritual group that's undergone persecution by the Chinese Communist Party for the past 25 years.
Dictator Jiang Zemin at that time saw the practice and its spiritual teachings as a threat to the communist rule, and so they ordered a crackdown on it in July 20th, 1999.
And they tell me that the persecution of this faith is now happening here at home, with media outlets spreading misinformation that mimics that of the Chinese regime.
Fact check everything that's coming out about Falun Gong, because what scares me and what is the most chilling is we've seen the exact same media misinformation talking points happen in China before the persecution began 25 years ago.
One view that we bring to this conference and to a discussion, particularly about prisoners of conscience or people who are imprisoned for their faith, is that we can resist.
The International Religious Freedom Summit group has already laid out a 7-page approach that they'd like to see the Trump administration take to be able to promote religious freedom at home and abroad. For example, they'd like to see Trump leverage foreign aid to be able to promote that religious freedom, as well as continue to provide aid for those who are persecuted abroad. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
A big question looming as U.S.-China trade tensions rise. Could President Trump's tariffs reduce U.S. reliance on Chinese manufacturing? NTD's Jack Bradley taps John Sidelides for insight. He's the senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and former diplomacy consultant to the State Department.
John, thank you so much for sitting down with us here today. At his confirmation hearing, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that China is leveraging its financial surplus to fund its military. How important are economic measures in addressing the challenges posed by the Chinese Communist Party?
That's going to be uncertain, Jack. The Chinese Communist Party has completely prioritized the Chinese military over almost all other aspects of Chinese governance. And we know that Xi Jinping has ordered the People's Liberation Army to be prepared to invade Taiwan by 2027. Not that it's necessarily going to, but to have the capability to do so, that they intend to have what they call a fully modernized Chinese military by 2035, and to have a quote-unquote world-class Chinese military by 2049, which is the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party seizing power in Beijing. And by world-class, most analysts will interpret that as being able to project power on a global scale to match that of the United States military. So unfortunately, China's society will continue to suffer. Chinese economy, Chinese innovation in many sectors will suffer, except for one sector, Jack, and that's technology. Because the Chinese understand, as do we here in the United States, that technological supremacy will direct the global economy of the 21st century. So I think there may not be much we can do economically to deal with this attention that's being paid to the Chinese military, but I think there are very strong instruments that we have to work more closely with allies such as Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, South Korea, Taiwan, to make even the notion of a Chinese invasion or a naval blockade around Taiwan or further aggression against the Philippines or against Japan to be far more painful to the Chinese military and, of course, to the Chinese Communist Party than the benefits of any such military operations.
John, part of President Trump's plan, we know, his economic plan, as he outlined during his campaign, is to reduce reliance on foreign countries, particularly authoritarian regimes like China. So when it comes to supply chain issues, could the latest tariffs make America less dependent on Chinese manufacturing in the long term?
That remains to be seen. I mean, we don't know if these tariffs will be in place for weeks or months, whether there'll be some type of a grand bargain between President Trump and Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping. So a lot of this remains quite uncertain. I think what's going to be important here is to decouple the American defense industrial base from dependence on China. There was a shocking report that came out about a year or so ago, Jack, that demonstrated that almost all of our major American defense contractors are utterly dependent on Chinese manufacturers for ball bearings, for magnets, for semiconductors, for chips, and for a whole host of components and materials, not to build our larger systems, but for the thousands and tens of thousands of small parts that are so essential for full assembly here in the United States. And of course, we learned during the COVID lockdowns that much of our pharmaceutical industry is dependent on the manufacturing of precursor chemicals in China, as we mentioned before with fentanyl. And in the event of a crisis, say around the Philippines or the South China Sea or Taiwan, the Chinese government could all of a sudden declare that there are a number of disruptions in the supply chains of these essential pharmaceuticals that could lead to the deaths of thousands, if not tens of thousands of ailing Americans who are dependent on weeks or months of supplies of these drugs that are dependent on China. So I think in these types of national security, medical and health and well-being industries, we will continue to try to decouple from Chinese factory floor and industrial-based manufacturing, but we really need to see to what extent this is going to influence, say, the consumption of electronic goods, T-shirts, furniture. I mean, these are not essential to the national well-being. They're more consumer products and amusement products.
Fascinating insights as always. John Sidolides, thank you very much for your insights here today.
Thank you for having me, Jack.
Chinese e-commerce platforms like Temu, Shein, and AliExpress might soon face obstacles to running their businesses in Europe. The European Union has proposed new measures to curb the flow of cheap Chinese products flooding its markets. The move follows a similar action taken by the U.S. Here's more.
The European Commission released a statement yesterday calling on EU lawmaking bodies to accelerate a proposed customs reforms. Here's what's at stake. Packages worth less than about $156 can currently enter the union duty-free, and Chinese e-commerce platforms benefit the most from this policy. 90% of these shipments in 2024 came from China. Lawmakers have voiced concern that these dirt-cheap Chinese products could expose consumers to harmful chemicals as well as undermine local businesses. A proposal calling for cancellation of the duty-free rule has been on the table for 2 years. Now officials are urging the EU Parliament to expedite the voting process. Earlier this week, President Trump also signed an executive order to revoke a rule allowing cheap Chinese goods to enter the U.S. duty-free.
Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.